He is Spencer Ackerman of the Washington Independent, and he is currently in Kabul, Afghanistan. I am just in Cincinnati, Ohio. Howdy, Spencer.
Hi, Rob. Good to see you.
Good to see you, too. You've been writing a lot for the Washington Independent about... You've been in Afghanistan for how long? 2 weeks?
For 2 weeks now.
2 weeks. And you've been regularly posting to the Independent, and I believe, I think you have guest bloggers at Attackerman. So recently you've posted a story this was sort of the most interesting to me, and I think will be interesting to a lot of people. You've posted this story on going on a raid with American forces and with the Afghan National Police. If you'd be interested in telling that story, because I know that most of the people who are watching this probably won't have read it, or won't have read it yet, and hopefully they'll read it after they hear you tell about it. So why don't you go ahead and tell that, and we can go from there.
Sure. I came out here to try and get a sense of what a deteriorating war in Afghanistan looks like. And on a variety of different lines of engagement, I tried to assess what counterinsurgency in Afghanistan appears to be, how it's developing, what its course is. Having reported on this a bit in Iraq, trying to find out what it looks like out here in Afghanistan.
Can you remind me, when were you in Iraq?
I was in Iraq in January 2006, and then again in March of 2007.
Okay.
And here, everyone's been hearing a lot about the deterioration in security in Afghanistan, the influx of foreign fighters from Pakistan into Afghanistan over the last several months, and naturally, most importantly to an American audience, the increase in American troop deaths over the last 6-7 months or so. Mm-hmm. And so I came out here to try and figure out, from at least a slice of eastern Afghanistan, what the course of the war looked like. And U.S. troops who I've been with have two basic fundamental missions. The first of which is to attack and attrite Al-Qaeda and Taliban forces, particularly as they exfiltrate from Pakistan, try and move up from Paktia province on the Pakistan border up through Paktia province, cut off Khost province from the east, and move up along one of the few paved roads in Afghanistan to Kabul, where they would hope to, put up a siege of the government.
Right.
And I've been in Paktia and in Khost before coming back here to Kabul. And the second mission that the U.S. troops have is to support, as you've heard about in Iraq, the development and the competence of Afghan security forces, the Afghan police, the Afghan army.
Right.
And what I saw 2 days ago on a rather important raid in Paktia province was how the second mission, supporting the Afghan security forces, has gotten in the way of the first mission, going after the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And what happened was I went with a platoon known as the Hooligans of Alpha Cavalry Troop, part of 161 Cav. They're based at a very small base in Paktia province in the southwest of Paktia called Zormat. And if you've never been to a military base before, a lot of the bases that you'll see in Iraq and Afghanistan are these enormous things. They're basically small cities, and in some cases not so small cities. Bagram Airfield houses, I believe, around 15 to 18,000 people at any given time. This in Paktia province, this base called Zormat, is basically cavalry troop-sized, which is to say a company-sized 100 or a few more people.
So we're looking at something like Fort Apache or something like that, where you would see in the movie.
Something like that. It's a remote outpost, and you have basically the equivalent of a company sitting on an army company sitting on top of a route that thousands of insurgents from Pakistan stream northwards along. So if this is basically a place where you would hope to stop exfiltration, you don't have nearly the troop strength that you would want in order to stop the flow of fighters up north into Kabul and cutting off Khost province to the east. So we went to find the big bounty for the area, which was a weapons cache that initially we had done. This was kind of crazy. A dismounted patrol in the darkest of night, and we're talking about a place that unlike Iraq, which has a couple hours of electricity
right.
during the day, in urban areas as much as half the day is actually electrified. In a place like Paktia province, you don't have that at all. You have generators providing the entirety of electricity for a house known as a kalat, or for a village, more or less. So you've basically just got a pitch black field in what looks like a bowl surrounded by mountains that elevate as high as 8,000 feet. And what we ended up doing on this raid on Saturday night was going to an area suspected of having a Taliban weapons cache, couldn't find it, and then a couple days later getting real pinpoint intelligence, really amazing stuff, human intelligence, about where in an extremely remote area named Spin Salakalat, which wasn't even on any of the maps that the troop, the platoon I was with, was using, had the Taliban moved the stuff over to. So we went out there. It took hours to get out to a place where there's absolutely no paved road. There's not even a dirt road that goes there. We were basically just going over farmland, and I was in an MRAP, those big vehicles that the Marines first bought and now the Army uses to guard against IED attacks. It was just pitching from side to side like we were on the open water, and inevitably there was a great amount of fear about how the Taliban would reinforce this position. We ended up getting out there in an area that could only be approached on foot to a clay house which looked more like a castle in the late afternoon to try and find this weapons cache, along with some other government material that had been stolen off a convoy of trucks. And inside we found a group of women who were very aggrieved over having their home raided, and we did this along with the Afghan National Police. And the platoon that I was with, because of a variety of restrictions on their rules of engagement, can't actually enter an Afghan home. You need an Afghan police unit to enter, and then there's an organization called the Military Police Transition Team, or MPTs, that go along with them. So the cavalry unit that I was with actually had to stay outside
now, is that typical,
of the Kalat.
Is that all over Afghanistan, or is that just in the area? Is that all over Afghanistan, those restrictions all over Afghanistan, or is that just local restrictions?
I believe it is, but it's particularly salient to the area known as RC East, which is the area that American troops are in control of. So that's along the Pakistan border in about the central kind of northeast. Below us you would find Kandahar, which is the historic seat of the Taliban, and there are other areas around Afghanistan where the Dutch are in control, where the British are in control, or in the capital region outside of Kabul, the French are in control, and so on and so forth. But here, the U.S. force that I was with couldn't actually enter the Kalat, so the Afghan police had to go in, and as the platoon I was with was providing perimeter security, all of a sudden, this cry went out that they had found this guy who was dressed in women's clothing trying to pass as a woman, so U.S. forces and Afghan police wouldn't raid him. And he came out, with his identification, matched the identity of the guy who our tipster had told us to look for. And his story had changed several times. The widespread suspicion, and justified from my perspective, was that he was in fact a Taliban operative who had been hiding this material in the Kalat. But what happened is the Afghan police were rather stunningly brutal. After this guy was placed in custody, he was held with his hands behind his back as he was taken from the Kalat. A very excited Afghan police officer took a wooden pole and beat him behind the shoulder blades. When the women of the Kalat came out to protest, he threatened them, and these were very old women. They looked around 60, 70, 80 years old. Tribal tattoos, very few teeth. This was a very poor area that we were in. He threatened them. The women were terrified, and the Taliban suspect, whose name is Dawood, told his Afghan police and his U.S. Interrogators that all of the material from this weapons cache and from this suspected raid off these so-called jingle trucks, which are the trucks that take convoys of material throughout eastern Afghanistan into Pakistan,
right.
Was at a nearby house. All of a sudden, the Afghan police, with matters already being as hairy as they were, came out. The same guy who beat the detainee Dawood and threatened the women came out riding this brand new motorcycle as if it was his own property. U.S. forces quickly realized that the Afghan police were going to steal this bike. Now, they had a right, technically, if a motorcycle or another vehicle isn't registered in someone's name, it can be impounded by the Afghan forces. But it was very clear to the platoon I was with that this was the only mode of transport available for this Kalat. It's 30 kilometers outside of any central location or any village. It's basically what this Kalat was using for transport to buy food and such.
Right.
And the Afghans, when they impounded it, the police were not going to give this thing back. They were treating this like their own personal property. And the platoon wanted to move out into the next Kalat to search for this weapons cache that, of course, was threatening them, was threatening the Afghan National Police, and was threatening Afghan civilians because the IED problem in Paktia province is really insane. And I can talk about that a little later. But when the Afghan police were told in no uncertain terms by the 1st Platoon's lieutenant, a guy named Blaine Cooper, that they weren't going to get this bike, they drove off. And they said that they would not raid the next Kalat if they weren't allowed to take the bike. And so all of a sudden you had this weapons cache that the Americans could not search for in the next clay hut or Kalat over because the Afghans refused to play. And the platoon had to go back to the base, more or less knowing that when the Taliban showed up that night after nightfall,
they were going to
knowing that the first Kalat was they were going to move the material, and now all of a sudden all of this dangerous stuff is out. And you saw in a really vivid sense how the corruption that I heard about from interviewing a number of Afghan villagers amongst the police was actually hindering the first order reason that American troops are in Afghanistan anyway, to battle Al-Qaeda and Taliban elements. And it was a really eye-opening experience.
Well, no, it was a fantastic story. One question I had was sort of when you were telling me this is how do they afford a brand new motorcycle in a place like that? Like how do they get the motorcycle? How do they pay for gas?
Yeah.
In terms of the impoverishment, I mean, is there enough there to pay for it, or I mean, what's the deal? Or do you have a sense?
Gas is a huge concern. In talking to a number of Afghan villagers while I was embedded with U.S. troops, and as well talking to something called the Human Terrain Team, which is this new counterinsurgency experiment in getting anthropologists and political scientists out into the hinterlands of Afghanistan to get a sense of what the tribal structure is like and what actual Afghan concerns are, as distinct from American intelligence concerns like, who's the Taliban guy in the area, how's he being resupplied, where are his safe houses, and so forth. They just want to find out how the tribes in the area and the sub-tribes and the clans view a variety of national problems. And in talking to the HTT, the Human Terrain Team, or Afghan villagers, there was a fair amount of Taliban nostalgia. And that didn't actually cash out to a lot of actual sympathy for the Taliban itself. At least, not that they would tell a Western journalist or, someone embedded with a U.S. military team, but rather a sense that, during the time the Taliban was in power, gas was plentiful, food was inexpensive, you could buy stuff for your harvest, you could travel along the roads without fears of being blown up by IEDs or being raided.
Right, these
Not
are basic
so much
order concerns. Basic
concerns,
Yeah.
Your first order concerns approaching day-to-day life, how it was that you would, survive the next day, raise a family, feed your family, get from one place to another. When pressed on, what people actually felt about the Taliban, and I don't have such a great sense that this was entirely on the level because, of course, I was embedded with U.S. troops, but I talked to a fair amount of people who were not entirely shy of talking about how, they had it better under the Taliban. And what they wanted to see the U.S. in one case, we were sitting in this guy's garden in Paktia province, and he just told a complement of U.S. forces, you guys should act more like the Taliban. Under the Taliban, I was safe, my family was safe, and food and gas were inexpensive. The motorcycle itself probably, in the fashion of banditry in the area, fell off the back of the truck.
Right,
it was absolutely brand new, it was spotless. It looked like, you remember Zed's motorcycle in Pulp Fiction?
Indeed, yeah.
It was basically a smaller version of that. Like it looked gorgeous, like this beautiful red.
It's a chopper, not a motorcycle.
And
yeah.
So what people would be saying was that during the era of Taliban control, they wouldn't necessarily want to go back to that political arrangement, but from a counterinsurgency perspective, you have to be very alarmed at hearing people say that the Taliban, as brutal and as repressive and as authoritarian as they were better able to provide for basic needs of the populace than the current Karzai government and the current U.S. force presence.
Right, and what this sounds a little bit to me like is Soviet nostalgia, right? Although, Soviet nostalgia has different components, but among Russians, Soviet nostalgia in the sense that there was order at the time, there was order under Brezhnev and so forth, in a sense that there wasn't under Yeltsin.
Right.
But it seems to me that there's simultaneously a contradiction here, because one of the most important reasons why there isn't that kind of order is because there is a war with the Taliban, right? If the Taliban weren't there fighting this war, the Karzai government might, corruption concerns being what they are, but might be able to provide more of this security that people
It's
are
interesting that you raised that,
after.
because that was a big concern for U.S. troops that I was with, in which you would see an enormous amount of frustration when they would come to some outpost, particularly in Paktia province, which is extremely poor. The literacy rate in Paktia is estimated at 2%. I'll tell you, unlike Baghdad, anywhere you would go in Baghdad, which is, despite the war, still has at least a legacy of cosmopolitanism to it. No matter how poor an area you would be in, you would see a satellite dish on the top of a building. Even in Kabul, where I am right now, you don't see satellite dishes anywhere. Maybe in the richest possible district, you would see it, but we're talking about areas even in the capital that are seeing really dire poverty. And where I was out in Paktia province, U.S. troops would be distributing humanitarian aid, food supplies, warm coats and jackets for the upcoming winter, which is going to be very severe. School supplies for kids, radios for a radio project that they have going, that sort of stuff. And the Taliban, after the U.S. troops would leave, would come into the areas, they'd round up the stuff, they'd burn it, or they'd confiscate it, and they'd leave a message threatening villagers, saying that they shouldn't collaborate with U.S. forces, or they would face rather violent reprisal.
Right.
U.S. forces would come back in a couple days later and try and distribute the same material, and find that they wouldn't have any kind of reception from the same area that had received the previous batch of humanitarian aid. And then they would tell U.S. forces, things were better under the Taliban, we had more security, food prices are so expensive, gas prices are so expensive, and the basic cost of living is so high. And U.S. troops would express a lot of frustration to me, saying that the villagers wouldn't connect their plight to the fact that the Taliban would be taking away all of this material. That no matter what, whether it was from fear or from nostalgia or from basic frustration, they would not be blaming the Taliban for the fact that they couldn't get the goods that the U.S. was distributing and trying in very good faith to get out to the villages. They would simply be seeing their objective circumstance as being bad and remembering under Taliban control that things were better. And from anyone with a counterinsurgency background, that's just a flashing red light about how you go about addressing that.
Right. The first thing that reminds me of is, I'm sure you've seen Apocalypse Now, and the sort of very, very coldly related story, what Marlon Brando relates about inoculating children in a village in South Vietnam, and then having the Viet Cong come and chop off all their arms. And this is obviously
it's a good parallel.
Much less horrible, but still, I mean, it seems to be the same notion. And it's also intriguing to me that when you're thinking about causal, I mean, what the villagers are assessing is the causal. I'm a political scientist, not in Afghanistan, but I think about it and things in this way, that they're thinking about the Taliban almost like some sort of natural disaster, right? Some sort of storm that's going to behave badly anyway. And so they're not placing any blame on the Taliban for doing this kind of thing, right? They're placing blame on the United States for failing to stop this kind of thing from happening, or to stop the seizures from happening.
Yes, I mean, I talk. What was surprising to me as a journalist was seeing how Afghan villagers could in fact hold both thoughts simultaneously. Mm-hmm. They would talk rather openly about the brutality of the Taliban's time. And how, in some cases, I was talking to this doctor 2 nights ago about just what it was like operating in Khost province, trying to treat people. And the Taliban would come while he'd be performing a surgery and tell him he had to go into a mosque and pray, at this prescribed time while he was trying to save someone's life, on his operating table. And if he didn't actually stop treatment on his patients, he would be murdered. He would have to go in darkness. And even still, he was talking about how, at least under the Taliban, he had, despite the obvious lack of freedom, the obvious fear in which he lived on a day-to-day basis, he would not have to worry about driving the 15 kilometers, that would take him to go from one place to another, and not be killed on the road. And that was kind of a heavy thing to deal with because, in no uncertain terms would you find people denouncing the Taliban, but still saying that the U.S. and, in particular, the Karzai government, which is seen as hopelessly corrupt, could come to any kind of term in protecting the populace. And to say a word about Karzai for a second, it's been a bit of a cliche, at least in the Western press, that America politically hasn't had an Afghanistan strategy; it's had a Karzai strategy, just supporting Hamid Karzai's government. Absolutely everyone I've talked to over the last 2 weeks, particularly Afghan villagers, are beyond fed up. They're disgusted with the level of corruption that the Karzai government to them represents. This is not a view with any kind of dissent or nuance. This is a universal view of absolutely everyone I talk to, that the Karzai government is hopeless, that they want to see it out of power, and that they want, in many cases, and I don't honestly know how well this survived translation, but what people were saying they want is they particularly, and I was all in Pashtun areas, where Karzai is basically from and supposedly representing. People were saying they want a strongman. They want a strongman in power who can address the security situation and more or less bring the Taliban to heel and bring back an era of stability. People talked about democracy in Afghanistan as a concept that holds no meaning, that holds no relevance, that if it has a particular meaning, they viewed it, and you can see this in I'm sure as a political scientist, provinces all around any number of countries, that they associated democracy with decadence in the capital, with a cosmopolitanism that threatens their way of life and provides nothing for them in terms of their material needs and their basic security needs. Right. And just simply provides a way for rich people in the capital to support a decadent lifestyle. Right. And they want this to end. And this was not a view that came to me with any nuance, with any caveats, with any exceptions. This was absolutely everyone I talked about the endemic corruption of the Karzai government and how they look forward to the end of Karzai. An Australian journalist who I've been traveling with over the last 2 days told me that he was in Kabul in 2005 when, you may remember an incident, on a hill overlooking the city, a U.S. convoy lost control of its brakes and ended up ramming and killing an Afghan truck and the people inside. And that provoked a day of riots in late 2005. And he told me, and he's a Dari speaker as well, that he heard people screaming "Death to Karzai, long live Ahmad Shah Massoud." Massoud, of course, Afghanistan's national hero, whom al-Qaeda assassinated on September 9th, 2001, whose picture is everywhere in the capital and in Pashtun areas, was Hamid Karzai's ally. And Karzai, in many ways, came to power by convincing the United States that he was a Pashtun figure, an authentic Pashtun figure, who was allied with the anti-Taliban, anti-Al-Qaeda Northern Alliance that Massoud more or less spearheaded. And to hear that anti-Karzai riots go on in his own capital in the name of Ahmad Shah Massoud really speaks to just how unpopular Karzai has become. And this was years ago. Over the last 2 weeks, I heard a unanimous anti-Karzai sentiment. And the question now becomes, with the prospect of elections in Afghanistan next year, some in the UN are saying conditions just are so bad you have to push them back to 2010. But nevertheless, the situation remains. Should the U.S. basically find someone else to back besides Karzai? Is it, at this point, viable to move away from Karzai, having invested so much in him? You know, who's the alternative? No one that I've talked to seems to really know.
Right. I mean, it strikes me that any alternative would be superior, not necessarily... Well, I mean, I guess some reactions...
I don't know. It's really hard to say. I mean, one of the things that struck me, hearing Afghans talk about how you need a strong man, you need someone, with concern for the country, was that no one who I talked to was thinking in terms of institutions, was thinking in terms of checks on power, was thinking in terms of what they could build to ensure that corruption as it exists now, doesn't remain systemic, doesn't remain a permanent fixture of the Afghan landscape. They're thinking in terms of a man on a white horse who's going to come in and save the country. And, that's,
Right. Their solution,
that's a dangerous delusion, basically.
Right. Their solution to corruption is not that there need to be a set of institutions that can prevent corruption from happening, or that at least can provide remedy for corruption, but rather that they need to install people who aren't corrupt.
Yes.
And you're right that that I think it's dangerous for two reasons. One, because it is an illusion, right? That people who are not corrupt, even that there are no people who are not corrupt in the absence of institutions that prevent corruption. And second,
exactly.
It strikes me, too, that it's a problem because the one reputation that the Taliban seem to have been able to hold on to is a reputation for minimal corruption. Whether that's actually accurate or not, I think what sort of maybe I've missed, but maybe a little bit of what you're implying and other things that I've read have said that they retain some element of this reputation for incorruptibility. And so to the extent that corruption is the problem, that actually benefits the Taliban.
Certainly in contrast to the Karzai government. Most people addressed corruption in terms of what they would see the Afghan police pull off. In many ways, and this is both a mundane insight and a bit of a profound one, as I found from reporting out here. The fact that there aren't roads in Afghanistan that we in the West would recognize as such is a huge, huge deal, and a lot follows from that. Basically, in order to get material out to particularly the eastern provinces where I was at, you have to rely on trucking convoys. And there was a very interesting reporting project that the Human Terrain team showed to me at a base called Salerno in Gulf province, was that they talked to what are known as jingle trucks. The jingle trucks are the convoy trucks that take the stuff out to the hinterlands from either they either originate in Kabul or they originate in Pakistan.
Why are they called jingle trucks?
Jingle trucks. Oh, it's basically American slang. It's basically like you see this in a lot of places in the Middle East, like trucks that are kind of decked out with basically what look like brightly colored sparklers and the edges of rugs hanging over the side, and sometimes with bells which make the jingles for the jingle trucks. And they move on forward like they're spray painted a variety of different festive colors and so forth. And so that's where the name originates from. So the jingle truck drivers tell the Human Terrain team, and this one quote was very vivid to me. that under the Taliban, times were bad and you would be killed, but the Afghan National Police just bleed you slowly to death. They would set up checkpoints. They would raid the jingle truck materials. We would see, big shipping containers on the sides of dirt roads. They would be overturned and, had their contents emptied. And that was where the Afghan National Police or the Taliban would be, taking the stuff off the trucks and just seizing the cargo for their own. Mm-hmm. Most drivers in Afghanistan don't bother getting licensed because it costs about $66, the equivalent of it, to get a driver's license or a trucking license in Afghanistan. And if the cops see that you have a license, all of a sudden they see that you have something to lose. And they impound you, and they impound your material, and they impound your license until you're basically willing to either pay them tribute, on the roads. This is rather literally highway robbery,
right?
Or you're willing to just give them your goods.
So so that's. I want to get back to the roads because it's been. And I know you've written about this, but because it's been a big subject. It's been a big theoretical subject. But you've been talking about the Afghan National Police right now. How much of a distinction? Obviously they are different and distinct organizations, the National Police and the National Army. But how distinct are they in terms of their behavior towards the Afghan people, their capabilities, and so forth? Or what sense have you got of that, if any sense?
The Afghan National Army is a program, is part of a training program to develop the army. That's at least 5 years old, and I could be a bit off on this, but it's a lot more mature than the police is. The National Police basically is the result of a program that started 2 years ago after seeing how bad the police were in a variety of areas, and after a reassessment of security, ticked up the number of both police and army that the U.S. and the Karzai government and NATO believed were necessary, as you saw in Iraq from 2003 to 2006. And nearly everywhere I've gone and everyone I've talked to has said that the Army is more competent than the police and less corrupt than the police, and the people look more to the Army to provide for them in an unbiased way without looking to skim off the top. One area I was with, this place called Zormat in Paktia province, in the southwest of Paktia, was the exception to this rule. The Afghan National Police, the same people who tried to steal this guy's motorcycle and wouldn't let U.S. troops raid this kalat where they believed weapons were hiding, was still assessed as more competent than the Army unit, the company that was living on the combat outpost with this cav troop that I was with. And they had gone through 4 different iterations, rotating companies in and out. The corps in question is based in I believe Gardez. And 2 weeks before I got here, actually 2 weeks ago today, in central Zormat, and this speaks to not only the distinctions between the Afghan National Army and the National Police, but also the competition that exists between the two of them, and the acrimony that also tends to be exhibited by both sides. There was actually a firefight between the police and the army in the center of town. And Afghan...
That's not good. I shouldn't laugh, but that's not good.
It was really actually quite scary from everyone I talked to. An Afghan army checkpoint encountered a plainclothes police officer, with his Kalashnikov and with his banana clips and his magazines, and he had said, I understand why you're stopping me. I'm going to show you my badge. You can see I'm a police officer. The soldiers believed that it was a fabrication, that he had gotten some doctor credentials from somewhere, and he was Taliban. They tried to arrest him. This was right outside the Afghan police headquarters. Reinforcements came, and within a couple minutes, in the center of town, there was an actual shootout. If you go to Zormat, there's no police commander right now. The police commander is on leave because he was shot twice by the Afghan National Army. And eventually, battalion came down after U.S. troops had come into the center of the firefight, shooting off smoke grenades, trying to separate the combatants, both of whom they're supposed to be allied with. Battalion came down, I believe, probably from Gardez, and immediately cashiered the captain who was in charge of the army company, and he was fired. And they put in a different company under a different commander in. Mm-hmm. But this really speaks to just how dangerous the situation is. Even if you're a member of the Afghan security forces, you can't trust the opposite force that supposedly you're.
And so part of that's institutional interest right there, but part of it, I could appreciate on the Afghan army's point of at least the fear of infiltration. Is there infiltration, Taliban infiltration into either organization, or do people worry about that a lot? A lot of infiltration?
That was not a concern I've heard.
Mm-hmm.
The concern was more among the populace that the Taliban was able to infiltrate into the country at will, not into the national institutions.
Right.
The Taliban, and this was also the case, if you study the Soviet occupation, the Mujahideen did not try, as we've seen in Iraq, to try and join the official army and police infrastructure and kind of chew at it from within. Mm-hmm. Instead, they take it on and they often win in an actual combat. This is an illustration of the point. The platoon I was with has been in control of their sector. In fact, I should say the company I was with, or the capture, had been in control of their sector since I believe April 1st, and they had encountered only one real pitched engagement with Taliban insurgent forces, and that was on May 10th of this year, in which they were basically ambushed, and there was a pitched battle that lasted hours. Mm-hmm. And they thankfully took no casualties, and they killed about 20 to 30 Taliban fighters. After that, the Taliban didn't try and engage the troops, even in the occasional complex attack. And you know this. A complex attack is when a patrol will hit an IED. Their vehicle will be disabled or arrested for a second, and then out come the men with guns to shoot at you, launch RPGs and so forth. Right. The Taliban don't even do that in this sector anymore. All they do is implant IEDs, and nearly everyone in the platoon I was with has been the victim of an IED attack. I believe only 2 or 3 people had said that they hadn't been blown up, and in this area. That's what you see. That's what you see the locals talk about. That's what you hear, in the center of town. Uh-huh. That the roads are so dangerous. The Taliban is coming back up and have their resupply coming up from Pakistan through in many cases Paktika province to the south to cut off costs from the east and get up on the main highway, Highway 1, up to Kabul. But you didn't hear, at least I didn't hear, people talking about how the Afghan army and the Afghan police, particularly the police with their corruption problems, were linked to the fact that Taliban or Taliban sympathizers were coming into those organizations. It seems like, following tradition from the Soviet times, the insurgency would rather battle the official security forces than try and corrode them from within.
Well, that's interesting, and I wonder if there's some sort of cultural reason for it. But anyway, we have a ton to talk about. So back to the roads thing. Return to where you were on the roads, but I want to sort of characterize some of the discussion that's been going on about the road system. A lot of CI counterinsurgency people have been making the argument that improving the road system is really important to success in Afghanistan. And I think there are basically 2 foundations behind that argument. One is that any improvement in infrastructure allows for an improvement in the commercial capabilities. So there can be more commerce, there can be more economic growth. When there's more economic growth, people have more investment in the society and so forth. So good roads are good for that reason. And the second reason is that good roads are good for a counterinsurgency organization because they improve the mobility of that organization relative to the insurgent organization. I guess broadly those are the 2 arguments that I've heard. Josh Faust just recently wrote an article for the Columbia Journalism Review saying, not really engaging with those arguments, but saying essentially that this doesn't really make a lot of sense, that you have a lot of IEDs, and IEDs cut down on mobility anyway, that there are a lot of road attacks, and so the roads really aren't something that are going to provide a lot of assistance for counterinsurgent forces, so that the practice doesn't meet up with the theory. And so
I would put a little bit of I would put a little bit of stress on Josh's argument, which makes a great deal of sense. But one of the reasons that the roads are so filled with IEDs is the basic fact that there are so few roads. Afghanistan, and this speaks actually in favor of Josh's point, and then I'm going to put some stress on it in a second. Particularly when you go, in mountainous areas, the basic fact of geography is that there are only so many passes you can have. And for any military organization, you need, roads that can accommodate, the weights and the, axle space that you have to, put, on mechanized units, moving forward. We encountered the unit that I was with 2 days ago, a footbridge that basically meant, a dismounted patrol had to happen because you couldn't put an MRAP over this bridge. It would just collapse and you would, fall into, more or less this pretty deep gutter. So, given the fact that there are so, few natural roads, there are, of course, going to be, IEDs. If you read Lester Grau's translation of the Soviet General Staff's history of the Soviet occupation, you see that one of the things that the insurgency and the Mujahideen in the 1980s were really great at was mining roads. Because, they knew the terrain. There were only so many passes you could take. You mine the roads, you basically stop a Soviet armored column from advancing, and then up in the mountains, you start shooting at them. And they're sitting ducks. And it's, a time-honored, technique here in Afghanistan. What I would put some stress on to Josh's argument is that's not the case everywhere. The U.S. forces have been pretty good in terms of knowing, basically when to use, when to avoid armored columns whenever possible, and bring stuff in, from the air. But operating out in sector, where you don't really have to worry in some cases in eastern Afghanistan about, just, traversing mountains, where you have in places like Khost and in places like Paktia, and in some cases in Paktika, open spaces where there are still very few roads. Those few roads, and these are mostly dirt roads. Very, very, few roads, are actually paved roads, as you and I would recognize them. Those few roads that exist are not the only natural roads that could exist, but because they are the few ones that do exist, and the infrastructure is so bad, those are natural IED points. And so as a result, you have Americans trying to avoid them as much as possible because they don't want to be blown up. And so you have, you go out in the fields and, as you could, Rob, talk about, a lot better than I do, that, results in a lot of, vehicular problems. These are, vehicles that have to just, constantly go off-road all the time. Dave Kilcullen, who's, one of, David Petraeus' counterinsurgency advisors.
Right. Everybody should know who he is. Everybody should. Not everybody does, but everybody should.
A counterinsurgency guru, he goes to Afghanistan this spring, and he writes, you can read this on Small Wars Journal, a really, fascinating, influential article just about, the counterinsurgency problem viewed through the lens of the roads, which, I haven't, to confess, I haven't read Josh's piece. I imagine, at least in the background, he's responding to Dave's piece.
Right.
But also from the historical sense of, any, foreign, military operating in, unfamiliar terrain wants to build roads. It just makes sense. It increases, your military mobility just so massively. And in Khost province, the biggest project going on right now, and they just put out a contract for it a couple months ago, is a road to connect Khost to Gardez. And from Gardez, you're able to get on a major, paved road up to Kabul. Khost province, unlike a lot of eastern Afghanistan, is a very fertile place. When I was there, yesterday, and it was pouring rain at one point, which you don't see in a lot of Afghanistan.
Right.
Khost is very green, it's very fertile, and the thinking is in this area that if you were able to give people who are basically harvesting wheat, not poppy, an ability to get to Gardez and then get their wares from Gardez up to Kabul, you would have a major counterinsurgency beneficent economic operation, giving people an alternative both to insurgency and to narcotics trades to get a tremendous amount of economic growth in the area. I am after I was superficially and initially very sympathetic to that. It makes a lot of intuitive sense. Mm-hmm. After talking to some people, not in Khost but in Paktia, over the last couple of days, I'm not so sure about that because what I heard from a variety of people is that in an area that's so cut off that basically lives as people lived 2,000 years ago, where there's basically no access to information, the literacy rate is more or less nil. Everyone's thinking in terms of what they can get in their immediate village. Subsistence farming is more or less the norm. At least I saw in Paktia, and I've heard about that in Khost as well. People are worried about just getting their harvest to their table, not getting their harvest to market. The hydrology systems in Paktia were described to me as just stunningly bad, and efforts by U.S. forces to just sort of give people basic hints in farming, and a lot of the guys that I talk to come from places like Kansas and Oklahoma, where they know a lot about this stuff, and they said that there wasn't a lot of receptivity from the population. The population was basically just happy to till their garden and put this stuff out on their table and not really worry about bringing it to market. And so you kind of have to be a little bit skeptical about the idea that if you build this road from Khost to Gardez, it would have such a
it would require a cultural transformation
impact.
too. It wouldn't just be sort of people responding to the market. You would need a culture of market behavior for it really to
That's
work
right.
as well.
And you would need a variety of education into why such a thing would be economically transformative and why that's even beneficial in the first place. So I mean, you just get a sense of just how complex the problem is and how entrenched it is and how deeply rooted in people's actual existing behavior that, from a counterinsurgency perspective, you also have to wonder about, how much can you go around, monkeying with the way people, live organically and hope to be successful about that.
Right, and that in itself could produce a reaction, right? Could produce a pro-traditionalist reaction, which the Taliban are going to take advantage of. We are, I would like to keep, I would like to keep you here for a little bit longer and ask you some more questions. How are you doing on time? Can you stick, or?
I can stick for a little while. There are two big points I want to make. I mean, what we should probably talk about from the perspective of an American political conversation.
I suppose we should talk about the American, but yeah. Go ahead.
First, Pakistan, and then second, the question of more U.S. troops here.
Right.
Pakistan, over the last 2 weeks, frankly, Rob, you would have more insight into this than I would because I was a total blackout from everyone I talked to. Do not talk about Pakistan is basically the rule among U.S. forces in the area. I happened to run in last night, actually the night before, in a base called Salerno in Khost province to Lara Logan of CBS. And she had just reported something that I actually haven't seen the report, but it spread like wildfire among U.S. troops in eastern Afghanistan that some soldier who people swore to me didn't know what he was talking about told Lara that they were allowed to just fire at will into Pakistan. And people insist that's not the case. They wouldn't talk about Pakistan except to say that this report was untrue. I haven't actually seen what she reported, so I can't really speak to it. But forces coming in from Pakistan, people describe to me more or less as a deluge. This is about traditionally the end of the time of year where the Taliban stream in from Pakistan. Usually the winters when the Taliban will retreat back into western Pakistan and do kind of like a lessons learned project, in some degree, like any evolving military will, and try and figure out what over the last 6 months worked, what didn't, and then adapt. Intelligence that I've been hearing, just rumor and chatter among U.S. troops, is that for the first time in basically 30 years, they're expecting a hot winter. That the Taliban is going to really try and contest U.S. and NATO forces this winter.
So to launch a winter offensive. Normally
is,
it's a spring offensive, and that's what we hear every year,
yes.
is that the spring offensive, the Taliban spring offensive is about
yes.
to be launched.
Yes, I can't speak to the validity of these rumors, but I heard them with rather alarming frequency. And in reviewing the history of Afghan resistance to the Soviet occupation, 30 years have basically seen cyclical warfare like we've been seeing, where they fight in the spring and they retreat in the winter. And, for good reasons. In the mountain passes, you get 6 feet of snow.
Right.
To hear that this winter may be different for the first time in 30 years of Afghan warfare suggests that if that in fact happens, we're going to enter a new phase of the war. That the Taliban wouldn't do this unless they were really prepared to launch something rather spectacular. And I can't say whether or not that'll happen, but enough people were talking about it fairly openly that made me wonder what in fact we're in for.
Right.
And that leads to the second question, which is, are there enough U.S. troops to deal with this? And
well, let me stop you there. Let me stop you there
yeah.
before you get to the U.S. troops.
Right.
I'm not. Well, you've been under blackout, so I don't know. But Dexter. I want to say Dexter Filkins had a fantastic report on Pakistan and Pakistan's relationship with Afghanistan in I want to say the Sunday magazine, New York Times. Did you read that? Did you see that at all? Or
I heard about it. I haven't gotten a chance to read the story.
Right. I mean, it talked a lot about Pakistan's incentives here, and why Pakistan is both uninterested and unable to rein in the tribes along the border, in which in many cases there are lots of cross-tribal connections. And it made the really good point that the Pakistani government, the Pakistani central government is suffering under a number of perverse incentives. That it has minimal control over these areas in the first place. And so sort of launching offensives into these areas has never been, since British times and since before British times, has never been a very productive endeavor for whatever central government exists in the area. And two, Pakistani government wants to use these forces, right? The Pakistani intelligence services and the military in particular are interested in maintaining control of Pakistan's hinterland with these tribal forces, which have significant relationships with the Taliban, and that are threatening Western forces in Afghanistan. And they want to use them not only for that, but because they want to infiltrate these same militants into Kashmir because of Pakistan's continuing concerns. And third, that Pakistanis are making just a very sensible understanding that as long as these tribal forces are fighting the Americans in Afghanistan, they are not fighting the Pakistani army in Pakistan. And so to the extent that these troops provide a continuous problem for Pakistan, these forces do, it is better that the Americans are fighting them than that the Pakistani army has to fight them. And the U.S. faces, absurdly perverse incentive too, because, we send a lot of money to Pakistan, and Pakistan can't really or doesn't really want to do anything, and so it's a tremendous problem. It's a ridiculously
one thing
awful.
That
so
I,
we send
that
them
I heard,
F-16s.
yeah.
So. Go.
I mean, one thing that I heard from a lot of people who I talked to was that, and these were Afghan villagers. I'm not talking about U.S. troops. Afghan villagers blamed the ISI for not just the Afghan Taliban, but now the Pakistani Taliban.
Right.
And
the ISI is the Pakistani security service.
Yes, sorry, I should have said yes.
Yeah.
The Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, which, I think it's probably fair to say few people, really know the relationship between the ISI and the Pakistani Taliban. Basically, a real frightening character named Batullah Masood, operating in the Pakistani tribal areas that you just talked about, Rob, where Pakistan has minimal control, established over the last 2 years and consolidated over the last year a new organization that calls itself the Pakistani Taliban that is believed to basically operate independently of the ISI. The Taliban, of course, in Afghanistan was ISI's creation for the strategic incentives that you just talked about. But the Pakistani Taliban attacks inside Pakistan as well as inside Afghanistan, and the Afghans still believe that both the Afghan and the Pakistani Taliban are basically the fruit of ISI's labor. And I heard that from a variety of people, that one of the reasons Afghanistan is in such dire straits is because Pakistan, meaning the ISI, wants it to be.
Right. Which, of course, has very or implications for the future of Pakistan as well and for the future of American policy. Which, anyway, we're talking about American troops, and I believe you wrote, and we've seen other places, 5,700 more American troops are being delivered, and somebody just called for 3 more brigades. Is that correct, or am I off?
Yeah, basically, American commanders here, particularly Dave McKiernan, who's the commander of the American sector in more or less, and well, he's basically the commander of NATO forces here. But the American commanders in the East talk about 3 more brigades here. What the Bush administration has announced as a result of a rather paltry troop cut from Iraq at the recommendation of David Petraeus, the now commander of Central Command, which has responsibility for not just U.S. forces in the Middle East, but for South Asia, including Afghanistan as well, is basically 1 Army brigade that was supposed to rotate on the next rotation into Iraq, now coming here, and a Marine battalion coming here as well. So that's about 5,700 troops or so. I believe a little actually less than that. But what really has been kind of amazing is that people told me that the brigade is probably going to sit between the Logar or Ghazni area, which probably means being based in Gardez, which is right if you were to create a kind of T, as insurgents stream up north from Paktika province. The brigade would probably try and sit, on top that route and create kind of a T shape. That
people should be following this on Google Earth. If you have Google Earth on your computer, try to follow this conversation. So.
Now I'm playing armchair general for a second. Looking at if that brigade is going to be positioned where I was told it was probably going to be positioned, it's going to look probably more at frontline fighting. Infiltration from Pakistan, going directly after, Taliban and Al-Qaeda elements coming in, as opposed to a broader counterinsurgency campaign. Now, it's possible that the brigade will have enough elements, and that'll free up other forces to go, elsewhere as part of Task Force Kurhi, which is operating in eastern Afghanistan. Suggested to me. So it's not entirely zero sum, but just looking at where they would probably put that brigade, the only brigade that we know of is coming here, that strikes me as more reasonable than not, that it's going to be focused just on trying to put a cap on the infiltration route. And there are pluses and minuses to that. The big question is that I have, that Congress should have, that anyone who cares about the Afghanistan war should have, is that what are these additional forces going to be put in place to do? Are you going to see a broader counterinsurgency campaign in eastern Afghanistan in particular, and perhaps southern Afghanistan as well? Or are you going to see more troops doing basically what they're currently doing now, with some important adjustments? Trying to protect, trying to create a tourniquet along the border, or creating protecting the main road routes, particularly Highway 1, which goes or the Kandahar-Kabul road, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Or are you going to see a broader counterinsurgency campaign, a change in strategy that additional forces would support? I mean, my point is that additional forces basically don't solve any problems. They give you a series of options, and the important changes are going to be, how you use those options that are available. The troop cut from Iraq that supports the additional brigade and battalion in Afghanistan is as small as you could possibly imagine. We're talking 1 brigade after the surge is now done in Iraq, coming out of the next rotation into Afghanistan, and a Marine battalion. And you know this. The Marine Corps doesn't basically want to be in Iraq anymore anyway.
Right. It prefers the Afghanistan mission.
Yeah, with the handover of Anbar province, it wants to. The Marines want to go into the fight where it actually, exists now, which is eastern Afghanistan and southern Afghanistan. What are these additional troops? Given that they've only been announced to come in Afghanistan in such small forces, beneath the recommendations of what commanders here want, what are they going to do? What are we going to see the Afghan war mutate into over the next year, when indications are right now the Taliban and the insurgency sees a target of opportunity that across the border in Pakistan, you have the beginnings of the post-Musharraf era. You have a very untested, widely seen as corrupt, and justifiably so, new Afghan president in Zardari, who has always had a bad relationship with ISI, who blames ISI for basically what he calls framing him for being, convicted on corruption charges. Even if, he has no consolidation of power. We don't... The Pakistani army controls the economy of Pakistan. And now they have to deal with the fact that they have, for themselves, a new army chief of staff, the guy who's been saying, if U.S. forces come into Pakistan, we're going to shoot them.
We're going to shoot them, yeah.
We're going to shoot them. And, is trying to navigate its new arrangement with the civilian-led government for the first time in 10 years, and for the first time with an army chief of staff who isn't, Pervez Musharraf. You're going to have over at least the next year, and probably the next two, a situation where, even leaving Afghanistan alone, the powers that be in Pakistan are going to be just testing each other to see where one line of authority ends and the next begins. And that's basically a dream come true for the Taliban as they exfiltrate into Afghanistan. And you see, for U.S. attempts to cope with that, just, in my opinion, nowhere near the force structure necessary to combat. Just what you can see is a confluence of forces shaping up to, provide a really severe, bloody, and tough fight for the U.S. and NATO and the Afghan people in Afghanistan over the next several months to, perhaps as 2 years or so.
Right. So what
this
you're
is
saying
a dire
is
situation.
Outlook appears grim, I think, is the Spencer Ackerman 8-ball reporting right now. Is that fair to say?
Outlook appears grim. There are, there are certain advantages the U.S. still has. I hope I've made clear, the population in Afghanistan is way more accepting of coalition troops than you see in Iraq. And I don't mean to damn that with faint praise. And second of all, the population still retains, despite the disillusionment with Karzai, despite the seeming sympathy for the Taliban era, if not the Taliban, a residual resistance to the way the Taliban want them to live. And a resistance to the increasing brutality of the Taliban. The Taliban, at least in some cases, like the best enemy the United States could ask for as we've kind of blundered along over these last several years, because they don't seem to take targets of opportunity when they present themselves. If the Taliban, I was talking to a friend of mine, the other day, and he was just speculating, like, the Taliban should have this in the bag. They should reposition themselves as a force of Pashtun nationalism, as a force of anti-occupation sentiment, to prey off of the lack of ability for the Karzai government and the Americans to deliver on their promises over the last 7 years, and they'd probably be in a much, much stronger position than they are now. But, to a great degree, the luck of the United States, the Taliban are a bunch of I don't mean to say that they're not sophisticated, but they are fundamentally fanatics. And they're
ideologically driven. They're ideologically driven in a way that doesn't completely preclude a nationalist element to the resistance, but that makes it complicated. Right.
Yes,
that
absolutely
complicates that answer for them.
And if they didn't have this hang-up, which in many cases is to say if the Taliban were not the Taliban, they would be in a far stronger position vis-a-vis the United States and vis-a-vis the Karzai government, but they are as well not able to translate that into opportunity, and time will tell. This is just to say that the outlook isn't entirely grim. There are certain advantages that stay with the United States, that stay with NATO. The strength of this alliance, despite everything you've heard about, national caveats, after traveling through Iraq a couple times and basically never seeing foreign troops off the base. I saw foreign troops off the base. And again, I don't mean to damn this mission with faint praise, but it's not Iraq. It is a vastly different set of circumstances, right. And there are some advantages that the United States and our allies still find ourselves with here in Afghanistan that just don't exist in a place
right.
like Iraq.
Although it strikes me that, from all the stuff that you've talked about, it strikes me that the most intractable problem here might be the Karzai government. And the problem is simply that the Karzai government is not, in any meaningful sense, answerable to the Afghan people. Right? It survives at the behest of the coalition. And it is responsive to the coalition. And so its incentives are all to be responsive to the coalition and not to be responsive to the Afghan people. And that seems to me to be a really hard problem to solve. That is not even necessarily solved by the removal of Karzai himself and his replacement with somebody else, right? But just the incentive structure for the Karzai government, for whatever Afghan government we choose to put in there, is still to us rather than the people.
And, it's a cliche to talk about this, but, institutions take time to build. And the question is whether Afghanistan can afford the amount of time, it will be necessary to build up institutions that could check the kinds of corruptions that exist in, conditions of chaos, as, you've seen in any number of developing nations. And, you wonder, if not Karzai, who? And even if, Afghans are looking to a man on a white horse to come in and, be the incorruptible person, outside of, a Taliban-like situation of, complete, totalitarian closedness, could you have, a force coming that truly is incorruptible? And I think, the experience of most countries on Earth is that, no, you can't. You really need these institutional incentives and developments and structures to block, people's natural incentive to line their own pockets.
Mm-hmm. Well, to segue, and I'll use the Alliance segue on this. Again, you're out in the middle of nowhere. You may not have heard this, but John McCain said this morning in an interview in Florida that he listed, I guess a number of leaders were listed for him, who he would refrain from meeting. And one of those leaders was the Prime Minister of Spain. And, of course, the Prime Minister of Spain is the Commander-in-Chief of Spanish forces, and there are Spanish forces in Afghanistan right now. And, of course, Senator...
Why wouldn't he meet with Zapatero?
Well, you see, here's the thing. I was wondering the same thing, and everyone else was wondering the same thing, and everybody thought it was a gaffe. And so the person on the radio asked him a couple more times, well, are you serious? No, he's the Prime Minister of Spain, not a Latin American country, because McCain kept mentioning Latin American countries.
So McCain thought. Wait, did McCain confused? I'm sorry. I really have.
Let me finish.
I'm sorry.
The assumption was that Senator McCain had confused Zapatero with a Latin American leader who he didn't want to meet with. But in fact, later McCain's foreign policy advisor said that he had completely intended to give the impression that he would not meet with the Prime Minister of Spain, who is a NATO ally.
Prime Minister of Spain? I mean, yeah, they're part of NATO. They're here. Why? I don't understand.
The answer sort of implied was residual bitterness over Spain's withdrawal from Iraq. But it's fair to say the McCain campaign has yet to give a fully coherent explanation for why it... I don't know.
So President McCain, any president in his first year in office or her first year in office makes a trip to Europe. McCain is basically saying he wouldn't meet with the Spanish. I don't. I'm stuck.
Well, right now he just said that he wouldn't meet with him. He didn't say he wouldn't meet with him. Right? He just did not say that he would meet with him when given the opportunity to say that he would meet with him. So, I'm guessing that it's confusion. That McCain just in fact did confuse names, but that the McCain campaign thinks it's more important to suggest that their candidate is not confused, rather than to alleviate concern that we will not meet our NATO allies.
Well, Rob, do you think this is like a senior moment or what?
Well, my guess is, do we want to call it a senior? Everyone gets confused, right? I in this very dialogue,
he's running for president on foreign policy experience. He says he wouldn't meet with the chief of state of a NATO ally.
Well, he also said that Czechoslovakia exists. Cut the guy a break. He was in the Hanoi Hilton for 5 years. He couldn't meet with any Spanish prime ministers while he was there. And so it's a difficult thing. So.
Oh man, he went there.
Yeah, Jesus. I probably shouldn't have. I'll probably get hate mail for that. But yeah, okay. So that was one thing. I guess that's the most exciting thing today. Yeah. Anything else you want to know about the presidential? You're out there in Afghanistan. You can't really follow.
What's up with Sarah Palin? I'm missing. I'm going to be back. I get on a flight to the U.S.
Well,
tomorrow morning.
When did you leave? Did you leave before the Republican convention or after?
I left during. I left. The last thing I saw was Sarah Palin's nomination speech. I missed
right. Well, then you will probably miss the convention bop, which seems to be ending right now. McCain surged to a lead of something like 4 or 5 points after the convention. Many people arguing on the strength of Sarah Palin's popularity with evangelicals. However, Palin's positive numbers have essentially gone into free fall. In part because of, I think, what are the continued attacks on her, but also because of some interviews that she's given where she hasn't exactly given the most complete answers to questions like, what do you think of the Bush Doctrine? And those have been both friendly and hostile interviewers. And so her numbers are in a bit of free fall, and McCain's numbers are also in a bit of free fall. I think Obama is back to up by 2 points in the Real Clear Politics poll. And so basically when you get back, it'll probably be in polling a similar situation to when you left, but there were just a bunch of Democrats panicking in between when you left and when you're getting back.
Yeah, that doesn't seem par for the course at all. Democrats panicking over poll numbers, yeah. I do kind of wonder, and perhaps we can wrap this up this way. There are a variety of blinders that any policymaker can put on himself or herself. In terms of an objective situation as confusing as Afghanistan, you want to have as few as possible. And you want to view American national security and American grand strategy in the war on terrorism as openly as you possibly can. Something that I would bank to that would be the fact that, for a variety of reasons, Iraq provides, at least more of an opportunity for withdrawal, without security implications. And I don't want to overstate this, and this is me putting on an objective reporter hat that I tend to shy away from. But in the interest of saying something that I believe everyone can agree on, given that Iraq is less dangerous than it was a year or two ago, you would think that you would then have an opportunity to take forces out of Iraq and put them perhaps in places like Afghanistan. If you are running for president on the idea of fighting in Iraq forever, for at least the foreseeable future, whatever that means, depending on however one wants to interpret the 100-year statement, or however one wants to interpret McCain's comment that by his first term we will still be in Iraq in significant numbers, albeit not in the numbers that we're in right now. It is disturbing that Afghanistan, a place where for all the reasons we've just talked about, and that U.S. intelligence, consistently has assessed over the last 18 months, right over the border, Al Qaeda central senior leadership has reconstituted its safe havens and continues operational planning. Is relegated to, in one candidate's series of foreign policy pronouncements, 2 or 3 sentences in paragraph 17. Basically, in the business, of journalism, we call this a to be sure statement. To treat Afghanistan and Pakistan and Central Asia as an afterthought in an age of terrorism is a very, very dangerous thing. And to run for president on the idea that this is a more responsible approach to governing is, in my view at least, self-refuting. And it's a credit, I believe, to the Obama campaign that, from the start, when they were getting criticized for it, in the spring and summer of 2007, Barack Obama has consistently said the center of the war on terrorism is Afghanistan, Pakistan, and if necessary, he will put forces into Pakistan to go after al-Qaeda and treat Afghanistan once more as the central theater of engagement that it should have remained since 2001. And
I think No, I think that's really worked out for him. I think that's worked, and it was a move by necessity, right? Because he had to demonstrate military toughness while at the same time maintaining his opposition to the Iraq War, and so it was in a sense, it was a no-brainer move, but it has worked out very well. A no-brainer move, except that other political figures for years have not been saying this, and have not been saying in anything aside a generic sense of we should be paying more attention to Afghanistan, and Iraq is not where the terrorists are, and so on and so forth. But that Afghanistan and Iraq, when it comes to U.S. real resource constraints, both militarily and financially, is a zero-sum game, as now you saw Admiral Mullen recognize. And seeing a potential commander-in-chief
come out and say that from the beginning, I think more is just politically worked out for Obama because I no longer have any confidence that this election, given that in the time I've been here, like it seems like every major financial institution in the United States is now gone belly up.
Well, there's that too. I forgot about that. Yeah, I hope you don't have any stocks or anything like that.
No,
you don't anymore.
Luckily, I'm an extremely unsavvy investor. But I just mean to say that maybe it's worked out politically for him, maybe it's not. I have no idea how this actually works out politically in terms of moving votes. But I think it speaks very well for a potential Obama administration in terms of U.S. foreign policy and the war on terrorism, and speaks very badly of a potential McCain administration.
Right. With the caveat that after 8 years of an Obama administration, we may still have 70,000 troops, or we don't now, but we might have 70,000 troops on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Yes, or who knows? We've invaded Pakistan and it's made everything worse.
Right.
Right. There are a variety of ways in which this can all go. Forgive me, to shit.
Exactly.
As you've seen. But anyway.
All right. Well, it's been good talking to you. Hope you have a safe flight home.
Same here, Rob. Can't wait to see you over here back in the United States.
All right. Goodbye.